Thanks very much for taking some time to have a chat with me. Very much appreciate it. Just tell me a little bit about yourself, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, sure. It's my pleasure. So I'm originally, very sadly, not a rocket scientist. I wish I could say that. But I'm actually, my background is in the financial markets. For the British listeners, I worked in the city, as they say. For the American listeners, I worked on Wall Street. And that's actually literally true in both cases. I both worked literally on Wall Street and literally in the city of London, starting out doing things like investment banking, focused on mergers and acquisitions, and then very quickly switching to the investing side, working for what we call prop desks and then hedge funds, investing a lot in the public markets. And then skipping a few years, I did some other things. I was a fintech entrepreneur in Brazil for a while, and I also went back to university and got another degree, a master's degree in artificial intelligence. But a few years ago, 5, 6 years ago, I quite accidentally slid into the space sector. And it really happened via initially taking a look at SpaceX and talking to some people close to the company. And I had never, while I was watching probably as many people, so increasingly exciting videos of SpaceX landing their boosters when that started around 2015, I never really considered SpaceX from a business point of view or financial point of view. And that's what I did for the first time 5, 6 years ago. And then it dawned on me that really precisely what they were showing in those videos, landing the boosters and hence reusing those rocket stages and hence making launch much cheaper, right? Because you're no longer throwing away a piece of equipment, tens of millions of dollars after one use. It dawned on me how much of a difference this would make, and how much cheaper it already was making space and how much cheaper it could still make space, especially once you're going towards an entirely rocket, as of course they're now doing with the Starship stack at SpaceX. And then I went down the rabbit hole, so to say, and started researching more and more, and I started realizing that launch cost was not the only thing that was decreasing in space, but that components of satellites and the entire satellites were also coming down in cost, and for a couple of reasons. One is just general technology trends, Moore's law type trends. And then also, as we're increasing the number of production, we used to make very few satellites. Now, SpaceX is probably making over 200 a month on average. And that has, of course, dramatic effects in economies of scale. So I started realizing all of these things over time, that costs were coming down a lot. And I started forming a thesis around space, which was that space was getting much cheaper. And because it was getting much cheaper, it meant that more and more things started making economic sense to do in space, including many things which never made any economic sense because space was just stereotypically expensive, and hence it was reserved mostly for government activity. But as you're getting cheaper and cheaper, more and more commercial things start making sense. And as part of my thesis, I started thinking that in the best case scenario, this could be very similar to where the internet was in the mid 1990s. The internet, in a way, it also was around cost decreases, if you think about it. It just made the cost of accessing the end customer much cheaper, because you no longer had bricks and mortar stores, but you could suddenly have an e-store on the web. And you no longer had to advertise on TV or radio. You could reach the consumer directly via the internet. So some similarities there. So we thought, okay, if we're in the best case similar to the internet in the mid 1990s, that's really going to be an exciting place to be, and possibly for a few decades. And that's why I decided to get more involved and form a space investment fund. Here we are.
So were you a sci-fi nerd when you were a kid?
I think I've always enjoyed sci-fi. I think when I was a kid, it was more the movies. Probably, as most of us, I've watched Star Wars back in the day, the original. And I've always watched a lot of Star Trek, even when I was a kid. I must say that sci-fi literature, probably in parallel with developing the interest in the space sector, I started consuming a whole lot more of sci-fi literature as well. So now I'm regularly reading sci-fi books. I'm always asking people for more recommendations of sci-fi books. I keep track. Some people say sci-fi can very often show us what the future may look like. There's some stuff which of course is ridiculous, and then as you're aware, there's a distinction between soft sci-fi and hard sci-fi, and in the hard sci-fi we typically call sci-fi when they're really trying to obey the laws of physics, so to say. And of course stuff like that can give us a better indication of what might be possible in the future than some of the soft sci-fi, which just may be completely made up. If you're just looking at even the Star Trek, something like Deep Space Nine, right, which is from the 1990s, they seem to be using basically what looks like an iPad all of the time, right? And this is 15 years before iPads were around. Yeah. And then, of course, on the more hard science end of things, of course, they're using warp drive, which, of course, is all about getting around the limitation of the speed of light via folding space itself, which has grounding in theory.
Do you ever expect to get into space?
I think eventually.
Yourself?
So the closest I'm to getting into space at the moment, or near space, I should say. So my fund has made a seed investment in an American company called the Space Perspective, which is proposing to use stratospheric balloons, right, to take people to around 120,000 feet altitude, right, which you're not technically in space, but you're so far up that the sky is black, you can see the Earth is round, thin blue line of the atmosphere. This is also why the company, I guess, is called the Space Perspective. And so we invested in that company seed stage, and I also have a booking on one of their rides. I think it's in 2025. They are currently planning to start operations probably in 2024. I don't have any booking on the rocket rides. I remember I was actually working in the city of London when Virgin Galactic started selling tickets. And partly because I was a young investment banker and you like to throw money around, I was thinking, oh, should you get this like rocket ticket? I guess I'm quite happy I didn't. Because obviously it took quite a few. Space, as they stereotypically say, space is hard, right? So, of course it took longer than I think everybody expected for Virgin Galactic to start flying. And now they've flown once with Richard Branson and a few other people, and hopefully starting to fly again soon. But it would have had to wait a long time. And now I'm going to do the balloon first, and then I may even skip the suborbital ride, because I'm sure it's incredibly exciting. And if you listen to anybody who's done it, there's now been various flights on Blue Origin and New Shepard, the other suborbital vehicle. And everybody who's done it seems to come away absolutely mesmerized by the experience. There's famously, of course, William Shatner, Captain Kirk, right? He was almost crying talking about it. But it is a very short ride. Like the New Shepard ride is, I think, takeoff to landing is about 11 minutes.
Yeah.
I really want to go to orbit and stay up there for a while. But that's still more difficult to do, obviously, and it's still quite pricey.
I'm quite intrigued to really explore is, although you do have the overview effect, but really what I'm interested in is what does all the space exploration and the investment in space, but what does that mean for the other 9 billion people that are it's certainly in the near future never going to go into space, and what's it mean for us on Earth and all the advancements that will come out of it?
Yeah, and that's a very important, very legitimate question. The first thing I would say is, let's rephrase. I'm going to divide this into two questions, and I'm just going to change the tense of the question in the temporal sense. I'm going to start with, what does it mean already? What does space mean in your everyday life already? And I think very often people forget that, or they may not be aware. But the simplest example is like, how often do you use satellite navigation? How often do you open up Google Maps on your cell phone to get somewhere? I do it all the time now. I cycle a lot. I went on a multi-hour cycling trip yesterday, and I put the phone on the front of my cycle, and I follow Google Maps, because I would be too lazy to try to find it any other way. And I think that's probably true for most people. So that's satellite navigation, usually important. Satellite communications, obviously, and we're hugely dependent on that. And I think people realize that, but maybe not enough. And it's not only in-flight connectivity, it's not only the internet on the phone, it is baseline communication where a lot of like cell phone backhaul may be done by satellites. It is also things that, and people don't realize this, I think mostly, that every time you take money out of an ATM, you basically use the satellite timestamping. And so if some of these satellites, sometimes people play these games sort of asking, okay, if suddenly all of the satellites were destroyed by, let's say, hostile action or a solar storm or something like that, how would our life be impacted? And really, like, large parts of our lives just would stop immediately. Weather satellites as well. Suddenly we could no longer monitor what's going on with the weather. And that, of course, has huge economic impact. So that kind of stuff has already been happening for decades. Earth observation for weather, satellite communication, satellite TV somewhere in there as well, and GNSS, right, the satellites used for navigation. Now, I'm going to shift the tense. What could it mean in the future? It's more of all of the stuff that I already mentioned: better satellite navigation, better Earth observation for weather and for climate, but also for many other things, like, for example, precision agriculture. So, right, that helps you with like food security. Or Earth observation for disaster monitoring and disaster mitigation after disasters have happened. That's another example. And satellite communications as well, especially now that we're putting more and more satellite communications constellations up there, including really quite big ones, right, like SpaceX Starlink and the proposed Amazon Project Kuiper. You're really going to be able to connect everybody. And that, again, has some positive impact use cases, like enabling more remote education. Actually, Elon Musk was down in Brazil just, I think, beginning of May, and he was meeting with one of the ministers. And from memory, they're planning on using Starlink to connect, I think it was 12,000 from memory, 12,000 schools via Starlink to enable remote education. And this is just the use cases I've already mentioned that have been around, just basically building on them with observations, satellite communications, and navigation. We're also going to have entirely new use cases in space, which are examples of what I mentioned at the beginning, use cases which are enabled by the fact that the costs have gone to come down so much in space and are coming down further. So use cases which really never made any economic sense, but now they start making economic sense. And one example of that would be in-space manufacturing. So taking advantage of microgravity conditions to manufacture certain things. And that could help us make better materials for various use cases, including, for example, better semiconductors, and which in turn could require less power. There's some examples of semiconductors used for telecommunications equipment, which would require less power, and that again would then indirectly help us with climate. And it could also enable us to make better pharmaceuticals, again, taking advantage of the microgravity conditions. So there's really a lot that space is already doing for the rest of the 8 billion or 9 billion who are not going to space, and increasingly will do a lot for the people. And I haven't even started talking about things like space-based solar power, which may come around at some point in time as well.
What's your gut feel on the kind of the time horizons for some of those Earth-based applications to start coming into fruition? How far advanced before there's some sort of economic benefit turned on from investing in that type of Earth-based technology that's being developed today?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it depends what you're looking at. So for some things, the time frame may be actually relatively near term. And so I give you an easy example. If you're talking about what we call downstream observation companies, and downstream basically means that they don't have their own satellites, but they analyze satellite imagery from people who have their own satellites, which could be government satellites or commercial satellites. This type of company, if they pick the right use case and really provide value-added analysis of satellite imagery, they can make revenue tomorrow, so to say, right? So you could get to return relatively quickly. There's, of course, the stereotypical stuff in space, which is more on the upstream, what we call the upstream side, right? Like hardware stack. And that at times can take many years to come to fruition. So if you are designing a new rocket, if you are building a new satellite constellation, it typically takes quite a few years and historically many hundreds of millions of dollars, sometimes billions of dollars to come to fruition. So it really depends on the use case you're looking at. And that's just the stuff that's, as you phrased it, using space for, which is where you have the better revenue potential in the near term, because Earth by definition has existing target markets. Then of course we have at some point in time, and that's a different question on the timeline, the in-space market, so to say, where both supply and demand are in space, right? So for example, refueling satellites, right? There's some people working on that, right? So you're providing the fuel in space, your customer is also in space. So there's sometimes we call it the in-orbit or the in-space. Almost by definition, that's a derivative of the first type of economy I mentioned, like the people who are serving some use case on Earth. So that would imply that the timeline for that is obviously a little bit longer. Another example of that, by the way, would be the lunar economy, anything that's going on around the moon.
When I discuss space with my 20-year-old children, they think I'm crazy. They've no idea really what I'm talking about. And it's a thinking process, really. For somebody in their early 20s, mid 20s, they could actually be investing in space for about 100 years, because the longevity, I'm assuming, is going to increase. So it's a way of thinking now for investing in their own future than that. But it doesn't mean that younger people shouldn't be thinking about it correctly and from an investment point of view.
So let me try to answer this in various ways, and also give the sort of required disclaimer that I cannot provide any investment advice here, of course. But the first thing I would say, and I come back to the investing part, the first thing I would say, young people I think should be interested in space for many reasons, and investing is just one of them. I truly believe this is going to be an exciting industry, an exciting sector for many decades to come. So yes, one way to participate is as an investor, but there's other ways to participate, right? It could be that you find a really cool job in space, and it's going to be a growing industry. And typically it's much more exciting and psychologically much better to work in a growing industry than in a stagnating or shrinking industry where, typically the environment is not so good, even when you go to the office and everybody's worried about their jobs. That's typically not what's the case in space at the moment. So you could be an employee at an exciting space company, even a big aerospace company or an up-and-coming startup. Or of course you could be a founder yourself, an entrepreneur, right? If you find a great idea. And I think that really most business ideas about space we haven't even found yet because we're so early on. And it used to be so limited to the space, and it's still most of the business plans, if not all of the business plans I get in my VC activity, they're basically sent by people who are already part of the space sector. And that actually was the same, at least anecdotally, I remember the beginning of the internet, that many of the companies were started by people from computer science departments. But of course, that'll change. I hope it'll change. We need it to change if we want to grow space really big. And that'll then give an opening for people from other walks of life to come and take advantage of the trends in space to become entrepreneurs, right? It could be maybe you have a really good idea what's going on in agriculture and insurance, and you somehow use space technology to come up with a business model there. So you can be an employee, you can be an investor, you can be an entrepreneur. Coming back to the investing side, so yes, I do, of course, that's my day-to-day activity, so I'm inclined to say that. But I do believe that a good idea to invest in deep tech technology and themes like that for the last few decades, if you were early on in the computer PC boom, if you got into that, and when it started in the 70s, you would have done very well. Another industry that started in the late 70s as an industry effectively was biotech. If you had invested there early, you would have done very well. The question is, what are those themes right now? I think we all know what the candidates are. Of course, I strongly believe space is one of them. I think biotech continues to be one of them for sure. Blockchain, we can argue about that, but it probably is. So if you're young enough, and frankly, even if you're not that young, I do think it makes sense to look at these themes and consider how it may make sense to participate as an investor as well.
Have at least something within your portfolio of investment that covers that. And the subsets, of course, like space biotech, there's a huge amount of event going on, experiments on the International Space Station and all that type of thing that are facilitating or at least moving those industries forward. And any kind of thoughts on finding those bridges to enter space as a humanity rather than as a separate political and geopolitical organizations?
And certainly, look, space is a very strategic domain as well. You could call it the ultimate high ground from a military point of view. So there's a lot of sensitive technology is involved. It's clearly, it's an extremely important domain for warfare right now. And I think that's been known for a while, but it's increasingly the case. And now these days, I think even your average person on the street somehow knows that, because look at any sort of given news article about what's going on in Ukraine. Probably every other news article will have a satellite image in it, right? And even before the war started, there was a number of satellite images, many of those from private companies, by the way, not government satellites, saying, look, there is a troop movement going on here, and it looks like it's really preparation for an invasion. So that strategic angle makes certain types of cooperation quite difficult. On the investing side, it's very difficult. You either invest with one block or you invest with the other, and there's a number of regulations around that as well. There's something called ITAR, International Trade and Arms Restrictions. There's other export controls. So it's not trivial at all. You typically have to either invest in one block or the other. So if you're in China, you can invest in Chinese companies. If you're outside of China, you probably won't invest in Chinese companies. Yeah. Having said that, I hope, of course, that we have the big historical precedent we have several historical precedents, but the best known one, the International Space Station, right, as a joint project between many nations. I'd hope that maybe something will be possible in the future again. At the moment, unfortunately, going the other way. So, for example, we had a joint project between ESA and Roscosmos for a mission to Mars, and that's basically indefinitely on hold now.
If there was one message that you wanted to convey to the early 20s to 30-year-old, that sort of cohort of people, possibly around investing, but possibly a bit bigger than investing, what would be the one thing that you'd want to leave as a message?
Yeah, I think it's what I already said, that space is going to be one of the most exciting sectors for the next few decades. So really think about if you had the chance to be there at the beginning of the internet, if you had the chance to be at the beginning of biotech, or the beginning of the computer PC boom in the 70s. Even if you're not yet part of the sector, don't make the mistake thinking that this is limited to a really small group of people. Yes, of course, if there are certain activities which are really deep tech, engineering driven, science driven, and if you want to do those, then of course you have to get a certain type of training. But there'll be roles for many other people. There's actually space will role for almost every walk of life to participate if you want to. And again, it's going to be growing for the next few decades. So you will really want to check out what's going on in the sector, what the big driving trends are, what the activities are, who the main players are. And if you're really keen on finding a role in the sector, you will very likely be able to